anything to be concerned about. Now, we also need to see that mitigation and adaptation coincide with several other social goals, because if these can be managed properly, then we are strengthening the basis for undertaking climate action, such as improved energy efficiency and security. I mean, these are really like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, there are huge benefits in improving the efficiency of use of energy in a whole range of economic activities. Cleaner energy sources, they obviously have major environmental and resource implications. Air quality and human health will be better. Reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas, that would have significant benefits. Sustainable agriculture and forestry, and protection of ecosystems for carbon storage. One of the things that we've also highlighted in the Working Group 3 report is the role of agriculture, forestry, and land use. Now, this is something that was not focused on earlier, and this is something that Robert clearly worked on assiduously for several years, and I think his voice has certainly been ahead of its time, and I hope the rest of the world will listen to what he had to say. Let me end by just giving you these two quotations. Humans merely share the earth. We can only protect the land, not own it. This is something that Chief Seattle said. You know, I think we as a society have perhaps become very acquisitive. We have started arrogating ourselves to believe that we can dominate nature. Now, that is a falsehood that, you know, the world cannot pursue for all time to come. Nature is supreme. And of course, another quotation from Gandhi used to be that you can use the resources of nature any way you want, but in her books, he said, the debits are equal to the credits. Now, we have only been concerned with one side of this accounting book. We have not looked at what we are doing in terms of damaging and degrading the situation with the health of natural resources. And I think Gandhi also said speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. We tend to measure GDP as though that is the sole and most definitive way of measuring human prosperity, human well-being, human success. But if that's taking us in the wrong direction, then clearly the growth of GDP and the speed at which we grow is not quite relevant. So with this, I'd like to dedicate the very modest presentation that I've given you to my good friend Robert. And I would like to assure all his friends and certainly his family that coming from a part of the world where we believe the human soul doesn't really come to an end, Robert will be with us, and all that he worked for, all his ideas and thoughts will guide us in the years ahead. And I want to pay a tribute to a remarkable human being and a wonderful friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for that very inspiring talk. The next item on the agenda is basically some of the friends and professional colleagues of Robert, whom we knew best, sharing some of their thoughts with us, both on Robert and on the subject that we are discussing today. I will first request Mr. Herman Daly to come and say a few words. Oh, I'm sorry. I think the mic was not on. I'm requesting Herman Daly to share a few thoughts about Robert Goodland with us. Speakers have a choice of either coming to the podium or coming to either of the mics there. They're all covered by our filming teams.
As everyone knows, Robert was the first ecologist to be hired by the World Bank. And that was 25 years ago. And he provided leadership in increasing the bank's sensitivity to the costs of growth, both environmental and social costs. The perception was that these costs had been vastly underestimated. And Robert was given the enormous job of coming up with better estimates and with operationalizing those into bank procedures. Well, it was my great pleasure to work with Robert for 6 years within the World Bank. And then for some 20 years afterwards, after I left the World Bank to return to academia, I did not quite have Robert's staying power, but we continued our collaboration and friendship. So as I said, Robert's task was to inject into the bank's traditional goal of development a much greater emphasis on social justice and environmental sustainability, and not simply to follow real GDP as if it were an adequate measure of human improvement. Well, I would say that this was such a large task that it was perhaps humanly impossible. And yet Robert gave heroic effort and accomplished a great deal. One of the things he accomplished was the Environmental Assessment Handbook, which became the sort of the Bible for all development banks and many national development agencies for evaluating environmental consequences and costs and balancing them against economic benefits. All of this Robert was doing more than 25 years ago. And events have made this task much more urgent today than 25 years ago, as we have heard from Dr. Pachauri, who's given us plenty of evidence to see the increasing urgency of the tasks which were begun by Robert and others within the World Bank. Well, I pray that the current World Bank staff, plus many NGO activists with whom Robert worked, and academics, will take renewed inspiration from Robert's life and continue his important contributions. My friendship with Robert was really a major blessing in my life. So perhaps you'll let me take just a couple minutes of personal reflection. I asked myself, how did this friendship come about? You know, was it just happenstance, or was there some providence involved? Well, I'll tell you how it happened, and then you can decide the mixture of circumstance and providence. While I was teaching at Louisiana State University, I made friends with a botanist, a fellow named Bernard Lowy, who had worked in the Amazon collecting fungi and had run across Robert, I think. Well, my interest in fungi was minimal, and Bernie's interest in economics was even less. Plus, we had what you might call a personality conflict. Bernie was a kind of pushy New York Yankee, and I was perhaps sort of a laid-back Southerner. Well, you might ask, how in the world did we ever become friends? Well, the same way that men frequently become friends, our wives first became friends, and we were more or less forced to spend a certain amount of time in each other's company, and we decided to make the best of it. Well, so one day Bernie loaned me this book that he had come across, Amazon Jungle, From Green Hell to Red Desert by Irwin and Goodland. I think his intention was to annoy me because he knew I was a development economist, and this book was quite critical of development in the Amazon. But I loved the book. I thought it was great. And I began to use it in one of the courses I was teaching. And I even took Bernie to lunch to thank him for recommending it. And then I also wrote to this fellow Goodland, who at the time was at the New York Botanical Garden, and I asked him for anything else he may have written on this subject. And so that was the beginning. That was the first contact, which slowly grew over the years into a very deep friendship. So, moral of this story: unlikely beginnings can lead to unforeseen blessings. May Robert's legacy lead to many future blessings on a much higher scale. We certainly need them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. May I now request Professor Lee Talbot to come and share a few of his thoughts with us.
Well, I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing Robert for something over 50 years. He and I have walked and worked together all over the world on several continents. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is very briefly share a few vignettes which cast some light on why so many of us feel so deeply about Robert. First, I think really important, Robert always sought to help and promote other people. I never heard him brag or promote himself. He loved to bring people together in small groups or large parties, and he often did this in his home. Back before he had the good judgment and good luck to marry John Min, he had an apartment near the National Zoo in Washington. And I remember attending a number of environmental evenings there, partly listening to the environmental talk and partly listening to howling wolves. Now later, with John Min, the two of them moved with their parties to lovely houses in McLean. Robert's guests were always an eclectic lot. They ranged all over the place. On the one hand, you'd have buttoned-down World Bank or White House types, and on the other hand, you'd have activists, and sometimes rather scruffy activists. The common bond with such a wide-ranging group was Robert and the environmental concerns and the concerns with people of his wide-ranging guests. And he often used these parties to celebrate some accomplishment, a publication or some other accomplishment of some of his guests. A high point in many ways for Robert and for, I think, many of his friends was when he and John Min were married in a lovely ceremony in a park in Washington. I think that John Min has been an absolutely perfect wife and supporter for Robert and his environmental work. Now, he was not a joiner. In fact, I don't know whether any NGOs would claim him for membership, but he was a source of information, inspiration, and encouragement to people, NGOs, ranging all the way from activist groups to think tanks. Around 1980, when I was Director General of IUCN, I did a survey of world environmental effort. The total governmental and non-governmental expenditures on environment that year that we could collate at IUCN was in the neighborhood of $57 million. At the same time, the flow of resources from the OECD countries to developing countries was quite a few billion. Consequently, I decided that from the standpoint of getting the biggest bang for your buck, after IUCN, I would try to focus on some of these billions into what I thought would be more environmentally friendly activities. So consequently, I decided that the World Bank was the logical place to go. And then I discovered that Robert was already here and was already doing this. So over the several years, we strategized. And I think it was 1983 I came to the bank as a consultant. Now, when Robert came to the bank, as was mentioned, he was the only ecologist. Indeed, he was the one environmentalist out of about 10,000 economists, managers, and other World Bank types. In the late 70s and early 80s, he was in the Environment Office under a very difficult person who seemed very much more focused on personal politics and bureaucracy than on environment. In spite of this very real challenge, and having clashed with this gentleman on various occasions, I know what a challenge it must have been for Robert. In his quiet and determined way, Robert accomplished a very great deal. And I think he probably had more lasting benefit, more lasting influence on the policies and procedures of the World Bank than any other individual, World Bank presidents included. He was also the entry point in the bank for people from NGOs who were concerned about the bank's impact on environment and indigenous people, but who had been stonewalled by others in the bank. Later, as members of the panel of experts for the Ertan High Dam in China, Robert and I wondered what was going to happen to the people and environment in the 150-kilometer-long gorge that was to be inundated by this dam. When we asked the Chinese managers, they assured us nothing, that there was nobody there, and certainly none of the indigenous, none of the minority Li people. Well, believing that we really ought to see things for ourselves, Robert and I spent the next 3 days walking that 150 kilometers down the gorge, and we spent 2 nights in Li villages, which would have been subsequently about 100 meters under the water level. When we reported what we found to the Chinese managers, and we showed them our photos, they told us with perfectly straight faces that there were no minority people in that gorge. Well, Robert didn't get ruffled by this, and even later he didn't get ruffled when the people here at the World Bank didn't support our documented evidence about the minority people schistosomiasis, and various other environmental disasters. Robert was consistently unruffled from what I could see. He never raised his voice, as far as I know, except in mirth. He always seemed to be in very good humor, regardless of the situation. Situations that would have driven me up the wall, he just smiled and politely said, well, that's a problem, and how do we deal with it? I think he's one of the most even-tempered people I ever knew. And as I mentioned, he was unfailingly polite. He was extremely serious about his work, but seemed to get great joy out of life and of other people. He was also responsible for my joining the panel of experts for the largest development project in Laos. In 1997, he and I were together on an initial part of the exploration of a largely unexplored, roadless area about the size of Delaware in the high Annamite Mountains. We were dropped by helicopter up at the crest and walked and rafted out. In the forests, the people we met were Vietic minorities, some of whom had never seen Westerners before, they told us. And since they were rather short of stature, they would come up roughly to Robert's lower ribs. And I have wonderful memories of their clustering around Robert, looking up at him. To them, he must have been a very gentle, very genial giant. Also, he remained unruffled when both of our rubber Zodiacs hit rocks and sank. And we had to swim and walk out. He also, in this occasion and many others, remained remarkably neat. I could never quite understand this. For example, I recall him sitting on a rock in the middle of a rain-swollen river in Laos in a perfectly white safari-type shirt and perfectly combed hair. One of my proudest times was when I had the honor of presenting Robert with the internationally prestigious Harold J. Coolidge Award of the IUCN. This was a medal, and afterwards, Robert smilingly chided me for not kissing him on both cheeks. Well, Robert, his humor, his generous spirit, enthusiasm, warm heart, wise counsel, and effective environmental and social concerns, he is sorely missed.
Thank you, Professor Talbot, for that very moving ideas on Robert. We have to have a look at the clock also, so I'd request the speakers who follow to be slightly briefer if you could. Request so that we can have more questions from the floor on the substantive subject of this evening. May I now request Salah El-Serafy to come and share a few thoughts with us.
Oh, I have been thinking a lot about this occasion, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Pachauri for a most able presentation, where he didn't actually forget to mention Robert at every junction. And it was I learned a lot from it, and of course, it goes without saying that what I want to say something is I'm not an environmentalist in any way. I'm an economist. And Robert was always suspicious of economists. But we managed to be very, very good friends. And of course, his favorite economist was Herman Daly. But he, at some stage, said I was doing more for the environment from the center where I was in the bank than many people who are supposed to be environmentalists. One of the greatest things our lives touched, of course we were very, very close friends, was when he noticed my work on depletable resources. I had written about the revenue of the oil exporters not being income, but it was the revenue had a content of the of natural resources, which I named a user cost. And I produced a formula in order to calculate income out of the revenue. And this caught his eye. And he invited me to this an initiative which he had he had instigated with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. And it was sort of trying to find common ground between the bank and UNEP. And he invited me to the third meeting, and I was rapporteur for that meeting. And then I was co-opted as chairman for 2 successive meetings. And we managed to change the momentum of the initiative into adjusting the system of the United Nations to reflect environmental losses. And we thought we succeeded. And then it's many, many stages in the process. And then came the major change of the SNA system, the System of National Accounts, in December 1993. And something called, there was a lot of dispute about methodology, how to deduct. And we were very open-eyed. We knew that it was a slow process, it was gradual, and it will come in time if we put enough effort and analysis in it. But the system, apparently the designer of the new system were very afraid of the environment. They didn't want the environment to mess up the national accounts. They wanted the national accounts to remain unchanged and GDP to remain unchanged. And lo and behold, to this day, GDP has not changed. They, as a trick perhaps, they opened up something called satellite accounts. We knew about the satellite accounts, and the satellite accounts was appended to the system. It was not in the system. And they imagined that we can, if we want to say anything about the environment, let us just put them in the satellite accounts. And this has happened. And we, to cut a long story short, something happened very recently, which is a document came out this year called A System of Environmental Economic Accounts 2012, Central Framework. And this document has got the World Bank on it. And of course, it has the United Nations Secretary General, the European Community, even FAO. What is amazing is that the World Bank, which had invested so much time and energy and resources in trying to change GDP, it's now supporting something peripheral called satellite accounts. can't imagine how the United Nations Secretary General wrote the preface to this document. And the document is all on the periphery. It is all on satellite accounts. My interpretation is it is a diversion, and we will be living with GDP to the rest of our lives because the World Bank has lent its name to supporting and the Secretary General of the United Nations. It is very much like the Pope siding with the flat earthers against Galileo. And, and really it is the same. I'm sorry I didn't talk about Robert Goodland and I walked not just for 3 months, but for years around the bank. And I had to have operations on both my knees. So you are lucky to have only 3 months. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. El-Serafy. I now request Dr. George Ledec to come and say a few words.
Good afternoon, everyone. Robert helped launch my career at the World Bank, and I know that that was the case for other World Bank staff as well, and he inspired a great many others. He was a terrific mentor. He taught me a great deal of what I needed to know to survive at the World Bank